Mr. Toffaletti, you are Secretary General of the European Digital SME Alliance. What's the purpose, what's the mission of the Alliance?
This is an association that represents ICT small and medium-sized enterprises. So companies that have a size below 250 employees and that fulfill a European definition for SMEs, and companies that are in the ICT sector, so digital providers. We think there is a need to promote and better represent the interest of this type of enterprises in Europe, because Europe is in the midst of an industrial revolution, the digital revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, so to say. And we believe it is important for our continent, our economy, to focus on indigenous companies. We cannot afford, as a continent, to be driven by others, to be driven by the Google, the Microsoft, the Apple, all foreign companies, which are really on the driving seat of this industrial revolution right now. And as a continent, as Europe, we need to develop our own industry, our own strength, to be able to look at the future and to maintain our wealth and our democracy even. I'm talking about democracy because you have seen the cases of Cambridge Analytica, how Facebook has been used to steer elections in the US, to influence elections in the US, or to influence the Brexit vote. So technology nowadays really is important in many aspects, not just economy, but also the freedom of our own societies and our own democracies. So we believe that Europe needs to have a strategy, an industrial strategy, to get the industrial capacity to drive this revolution.
What should be the major components of such a European strategy? Is it just about competitiveness, or is it also about certain kind of values, European values, that should stand behind such a strategy?
We are, first of all, talking about the competitiveness of our industry, but this doesn't happen in a silos, because Europe has a certain set of values and ethics, for instance, in terms of privacy, data protection. Europe has the worldwide highest standards in terms of personal data protection, the so-called GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which was the first in the world, and which is being copied or is inspiring regulation, legislation in other regions in the world, because it is setting the standard for the protection of this data.
Are there other topics or issues on responsibility aside of data privacy that are currently discussed in the ICT sector?
Many topics relate to responsibility, and one of them, why not, for instance, is taxation. Europe is a continent where an SME is typically striving to be able to go to other countries. Each country has its own administration, its own legislation, its own bureaucracy, and for a company in a country in Europe, the first drive is to be able to internationalize, to go to another European country. Okay. If I look at the very large multinational companies, especially in the ICT sector, in the digital sector, for them, Europe is a fantastic playfield, because what they will do is they will sell in all Europe, and they will exploit the loopholes of our own system to be able to pay less taxes. We have seen reports where, on average, these large multinationals, they will pay between 0 and 3% income tax, whereas a European company pays 20, 30, 40% income tax, depending on the country where they are. So we cannot have a continent, an internal market, which is exploited by others for their own goods and with unfair competition towards our own industry. This is absolutely unfair, and this is, in our opinion, whatever you want to do in terms of responsibility, this is the first topic, because you cannot claim that your company is responsible if you are competing on unfair grounds against other companies. Everybody has to play by the same rules.
What's the main challenge of European SMEs? Is it about scaling up, so growth? Is growth limited by all of these different national regulations? Or is it rather about venture capital?
There are still many restrictions, and therefore for a company in the EU, if their market is national, obviously they cannot have the same scale of a company which is selling in the US. I mean, we have the case of Spotify, one of the unicorns, one of the global champions, which is European. Spotify was born in Europe, it had its own success, but it was limited until it went on the Apple Store, it sold in the US, and having the US market, they became a global champion. And then they came back to Europe, and it is now what it is. So only the size of the US market made it possible for the company to scale up. So Europe should become a well-functioning internal market where our own companies can benefit from this size.
What kind of policies, what kind of framework conditions would be needed to help SMEs in the ICT sector to become more successful, more innovative, and more responsible?
A very clear focus by the regulators should be on what is going to happen in terms of opportunities for our own companies. When we create regulation, we cannot afford to create excessive burdens for our own companies, because if we do so, whatever our own companies cannot do in Europe, others will do in other regions of the world. So there has to be a trade-off between enforcing a regulation, say on data protection, for instance, on privacy, that of course wants to benefit citizens and users, but there has to be a trade-off with the consequences on an industrial level, because we cannot forget that we are not in a silos. Europe is not isolated, and whatever is not going to happen here, others will do it elsewhere. For instance, think about machine learning or artificial intelligence. Whatever we don't allow our own companies to do in terms of training their own machines with data, other companies will be able to do elsewhere, in China or in the US. And by training their own machines over there, or even in Africa or in another region, by training their own machines over there, they will develop products, then they will sell here. So we have to play, perhaps sometimes we think in terms of SMEs and startups, with the concept of sandbox regulation. So leaving an option, a space where companies below a certain size can play with a little bit more flexibility and freedom than a larger company, such that they can try. It's a way of allowing innovation for companies in a space which is a bit less regulated, and where the potential damages are obviously limited in terms of impact, negative impact of whatever technology they are developing.
When we talk about SMEs, there are medium-sized enterprises, 200, 250 employees, and there are startups. Mm-hmm. Are there strong differences between what startups need and what quite, not large, but larger SMEs need?
The difference is, in my opinion, mainly on the vision for the future. A startup will typically have not all of them, but many of them will have perhaps a shorter-term vision. They look for fast growth. Sometimes they look for even for an exit strategy. So just 1 or 2 years and then sell. And that's the business of a startup. Either become very big or sell to others. Whereas an SME, a small and medium-sized enterprise, as even a mid-sized company, in Europe tends to remain a family-owned, a family-driven, family-managed company with a vision which is perhaps much longer term. The vision of a European enterprise is sustainability. The vision of the entrepreneur is not to sell his own company in 1 year. The vision of the entrepreneur is that the company continues to remain viable, economically viable in the long term. The entrepreneur needs to be able to pay the salaries of his own employees. And this is the first goal. And this is the strength of our own system of Europe. This is our values. And we think we should promote this type of companies and have more if possible.
A lot of entrepreneurs have the vision of being the next unicorn, of producing the next big thing, and there are a lot of new technologies coming up. What technologies do you think will be game changers in the next years?
In the digital sector, there are many opportunities, especially for smaller companies. There are some technologies, and I will start with the blockchain. Blockchain is, we see a lot of attention, especially from smaller companies, startups and SMEs, because blockchain is a technology which is accessible and a technology which is a game changer, which is scalable and which may really bring disruptive changes to potentially all the other sectors.
You mentioned data privacy, you mentioned blockchain. Is blockchain a solution for data privacy, or does it raise new concerns?
Well, it is a technology that has a great potential to be even a solution for privacy of personal data, because blockchain allows essentially to avoid intermediaries. We even have startups in Europe that have conceived, I know one that I have met recently, that have conceived a model by which they say they will be capable of remunerating the people who share their own data to the other apps. So if they can manage this system, they will essentially create an economic model for me and everybody else who have their own mobile phone and share their own personal data, like where I am, what I am doing, and so on. But by sharing this data, I will get perhaps a small economic remuneration in a cryptocurrency.
So the basic idea is that not Facebook is making money out of my data, but I am.
Well, there's probably nothing bad with Facebook making money with my data, but we think that perhaps Facebook should be sharing this economic benefit with others, with independent app developers, for instance, with SMEs, and also with myself, because I'm the one who has created the data. I'm the one who is sharing his own personal data with Facebook, and so the economic model should reward everybody, not just one company.
You've been involved in the development of standards and in standard organizations. Standards are important tools to establish common practices and requirements in industry. There are other tools out there as well, as for example compacts and principles, which have different characteristics. What, to your experiences, are the advantages of standards, and what are the disadvantages?
Standards are certainly a good way for industry to agree on protocols that allow their products to work together. It's called interoperability, which is in the IT sector is extremely important. So without standards, many of the benefits of innovation that we see today wouldn't be possible. Take the mobile phones. Mobile phones are based on standardized technologies. And these standards create technological ecosystems where not just one company owns the entire value chain, but it's a technological ecosystem where many companies share the same base standards and can build their own innovation on top. On the other hand, there are different types of standards, and some standards can become even a burden to companies. I mean, when we speak to SMEs, when we talk about standards, they immediately jump and say, we are talking about new requirements, new burdens, new constraints.
GDPR is a regulation which is much stronger than a standard, and it has been implemented in a very specific area. Are there other areas about responsibility or ethical requirements where you would say there is a need for standards?
Well, I don't think that standards are necessarily there to work in the area of responsibility. As I said, standards are there to ensure that products work together. Standards are technical specifications. Let's not try. Some people have tried to use standards in the area of responsibility, but to my knowledge, the results are questionable. First of all, what does it mean to think about a global standard? What does it mean to have a global standard on responsibility? That the same people, the same organizations all over the world, all type of organizations, all sizes, will have the same definition and the same practices and requirements in terms of responsibility. Wait a second, there is something that doesn't work there, because you have micro companies in Europe, which mean family-owned micro companies in Europe, and you are comparing this with very large manufacturing companies, for instance, in China or in other regions. Are we talking about the same thing? Obviously not. So do we need to standardize this responsibility? I'm not so sure.
Let me give you an example. When we talk about artificial intelligence, there's a huge debate about traceability of decisions that were taken by AI systems. So one of these standards could be that every decision has to be able to being traced back, that there is no black box. This would apply for any kind of company and any kind of size. So if mankind still wants to understand where decisions of AI systems come from, there would be a need for a standard of traceability.
This is an area where, as the other example you made earlier, the General Data Protection Regulation, where Europe can be ahead in terms of regulation, can be ahead and can set its own level that others will have to comply with. So in AI, indeed, there is a lot of debate about ethical AI and the traceability of decisions, for instance, as you mentioned. This is an area, indeed, where Europe can use its own regulatory edge to come up with clever and smart regulation.
There's a third set of tools which are more voluntary than standards and regulations. This is about principles and compacts. What is your opinion about these kind of tools?
I tend to think that sometimes these are very much driven by large corporations. And SMEs don't really have the time, don't really have the resources to be part of the development of such documents, of such guidelines. And this is, sometimes SMEs will just benefit because others have done the work, fine. But in other cases, those documents themselves, maybe they would better take into account also the reality of smaller companies. So I think when industry does this type of initiatives, there should be always a way to involve, to be inclusive, to involve more stakeholders, more smaller companies, taking into account that most of them will not be able to contribute directly. But for this reason, there are organizations like mine or associations that try to mediate, try to represent, try to understand the needs of the smaller companies and bring them into documents, into policy debates and so on.
The Living Innovation Project deals with the way we will live in our homes in 10, 15 years from now. So it deals with smart health and smart home. What is your vision? How will our daily life at home change over the next 10, 15 years? How will technology change our lives?
Now, what I hope as a citizen for my home, at least, is to be able to have an innovation which happens in an open way. I wouldn't want my data as a citizen from my home to be shared with one company that then will kind of lock me in their own technology, and I will only depend on this company, and they will have my data, they will do whatever they want with my data. I would rather prefer to be the owner of my data. Ultimately, I'm generating the data as owner or person who lives in a house, and I want to know who's going to use those data and how they're going to use those data, and I want to be able to select which companies give me services on the basis of my data. I know many services are possible with the analysis of the data, and I want to be the owner of those data and decide who's going to be my supplier. For instance, when we speak about energy consumption, homes produce data about the consumption of energy. Who has that data? The energy supplier, right? But the data belongs ultimately to the people. The data is mine because I'm the one who's consuming the energy. Do I have access to that data? Not so much.
Thank you very much.